In August of 2002, the heavy wooden doors of a Broome County courtroom swung open, and a towering figure stepped before the judge. He was not there to sign lucrative autographs. According to the official court transcripts from that exact month, Sly Williams was standing there to answer for the terrifying abduction and illegal confinement of another human being. How does a man go from signing massive professional sports contracts to wearing heavy iron handcuffs? When the gavel finally fell and he pleaded guilty to these incredibly serious charges, the public gallery was shockingly empty. Not a single former celebrity teammate or wealthy executive showed up to support him. The public records clearly document that he was handed a devastating sentence of up to 5 years behind bars, a deeply disturbing conclusion to a life that once promised unlimited greatness. This was an absolutely staggering fall from grace for a man who once had the entire basketball world resting in the palm of his hand. When you look at the official National Basketball Association draft archives from the year 1979, Sly Williams was selected in the very first round as the highly coveted 21st overall pick. He was drafted to be the ultimate savior of New York, a franchise cornerstone worth millions of dollars. Instead, his legacy became completely buried in dark police reports. Every basketball scout in the country saw his raw athletic power on the court, but they completely missed the terrifying warning signs that were hiding in plain sight. What exactly happened behind closed locker room doors between that glamorous draft night and the cold, unforgiving reality of a state prison cell? Who was secretly covering for his highly destructive behavior, and why did the league suddenly turn a blind eye when his personal life started spiraling completely out of control? To uncover how this incredibly gifted forward threw his entire future away and ended up at the center of a massive criminal scandal, we have to carefully follow the trail of broken promises all the way back to the incredibly harsh streets where he first touched a basketball. Long before the multi-million-dollar contracts and the explosive scandals, Sly Williams was just a boy trying to survive in the harsh, unforgiving social housing projects of New Haven, Connecticut. According to extensive biographical profiles and interviews collected over the years, he was born on the 26th of January, 1958. But the staggering detail that truly frames his childhood is the fact that he was raised in a household with 16 children. Growing up without a father figure in such a massive family meant that resources were scarce, and attention was even scarcer. For young Sly Williams, the asphalt basketball courts of his neighborhood were not just a place to play. They were an absolute necessity, the only visible escape route from a life of crushing poverty. As we dig into the scouting reports from the mid-1970s, it becomes crystal clear that his athletic prowess was recognized early on. Those historical documents describe him as one of the most highly sought-after high school talents in the entire nation. Yet, alongside the glowing praise for his physical abilities, there were murmurs of trouble. Whispers of disciplinary issues on the streets were completely swept under the rug by high school coaches who were too mesmerized by his raw potential to address his personal struggles. They saw a ticket to championships, completely ignoring the fragile psychology of a young man carrying the weight of his enormous family on his shoulders. Every time he stepped onto the court, he was playing for his survival, but the lack of structure off the court was quietly building a foundation for disaster. The recruiters from top-tier universities began lining up at his door, promising him the world and blinding him with visions of a glorious future. However, it was exactly during the autumn of 1976 that Sly Williams made a calculated move that sports journalists would later document as his very first great betrayal. The collegiate basketball recruiting scene is often a vicious, shadowy battleground, and the fight to secure Sly Williams was no exception. He was the ultimate prize, and the tactics used to win his loyalty were nothing short of cutthroat. Based on the memoirs and recollections of regional sports journalists from that era, the young prodigy had firmly made a verbal commitment to Providence College in 1976. It was considered a done deal, a gentleman's agreement that was supposed to secure his future. The coaching staff at Providence had already begun drawing up plays around his extraordinary skills. However, behind closed doors, a completely different narrative was unfolding. The pressure from rival institutions was immense, filled with secret meetings and whispered promises of greater glory. The tension culminated in a shocking twist that left the collegiate sports world utterly speechless. According to the reports published in the local press during that turbulent time, in late August of that same year, Sly Williams abruptly walked into a room and signed official documents with the University of Rhode Island. This last-minute switch on registration day was a devastating blow to Providence and a massive triumph for Rhode Island. But why did he change his mind at the 11th hour? Some sources suggest intense family pressure, while others point to behind-the-scenes manipulation by influential athletic boosters. This specific decision immediately painted Sly Williams as an unpredictable rebel, a player whose loyalty could shift with the wind. The shockwaves of this signature were felt throughout the entire region, setting a chaotic tone for his college career. This astonishing maneuver left coaches absolutely stunned, but the staff at the University of Rhode Island would soon discover that along with a basketball genius, they had just acquired a ticking time bomb. When Sly Williams finally stepped onto the hardwood for the University of Rhode Island, the impact was absolutely seismic. He was no longer just a high school prospect. He was a collegiate phenomenon. The sheer dominance he displayed left both fans and opposing coaches completely mesmerized. According to the official statistical records of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, during the season of 1978 to 1979, he averaged an astonishing 21.2 points per game. He was slicing through defenses with a unique blend of power and grace that seemed entirely effortless. But behind the closed doors of the locker room, a completely different reality was taking shape. The undeniable brilliance on the court was constantly overshadowed by a growing storm of disciplinary issues. He was missing classes, showing up late for crucial training camps, and openly defying the established hierarchy. His relationship with head coach Jack Kraft rapidly deteriorated into a series of bitter confrontations. The coaching staff found themselves in an impossible position, forced to balance his indispensable talent against his deeply destructive behavior. In the spring of 1979, his undeniable skills earned him a spot on the second-team All-American roster, a fact formally cemented in the registry of the Collegiate Basketball Association. Yet, even as he was being showered with national accolades, the internal friction was reaching a boiling point. Sly Williams was suspended from games, a drastic measure intended to bring him back into line, but it only fueled his rebellious nature. The constant push and pull between his undeniable genius and his chaotic persona created a highly volatile atmosphere. The university coaches breathed a massive sigh of relief when he made a monumental decision, choosing to leave the collegiate ranks a full year early. By June of 1979, a contract was waiting on the table that promised to change absolutely everything. The basketball landscape was on the verge of a massive revolution, and Sly Williams was standing right on the edge of history. The league was bracing for an influx of transcendent talent, with names that would eventually become global icons entering the professional ranks. It was an era of enormous expectations, and the pressure on young rookies was incredibly intense. On the 25th of June, 1979, the official draft protocols of the National Basketball Association documented a monumental moment. The New York Knicks utilized their highly valuable first-round selection to pick Sly Williams as the 21st overall player. The entire city of New York, a place completely obsessed with basketball glory, erupted with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The franchise desperately needed a spark, and they believed this powerful forward could be the answer to their prayers. The sports press heavily scrutinized the decision, with many analysts hoping that the rigorous, unyielding structure of professional basketball would finally tame his famously turbulent character. They thought the bright lights of Madison Square Garden would force him to mature. According to the official game schedules and historical rosters, he made his highly anticipated debut for the Knicks in October of 1979. The fans in the stands were ready to embrace a new hero, completely unaware of the immense psychological baggage he was carrying into the arena. Management gambled millions on the assumption that a professional paycheck would magically erase years of deep-seated behavioral issues. The big city offered massive financial rewards, but it also presented endless, dangerous temptations. The executives in the front office had absolutely no idea what kind of profound error they had committed when they handed him that iconic jersey bearing the number 33. The transition from being the absolute star of a college campus to fighting for minutes in the professional leagues is a brutal, unforgiving process. For Sly Williams, the collision with this new reality was nothing short of devastating. He arrived in New York expecting to dominate the paint, just as he always had, but the professional game was faster, stronger, and infinitely more strategic. The coaching staff quickly identified glaring gaps in his defensive fundamentals and a troubling lack of focus during complex tactical drills. Consequently, the man who was used to having the offense run entirely through him found himself firmly anchored to the sidelines. When we examined the official statistical reports from the league, the numbers from the 1979 to 1980 season tell a grim story. He averaged a mere 9.8 minutes on the hardwood per game. This drastic reduction in playing time was a massive blow to his fragile ego. Over the course of 57 games played that year, the archives of sports analysts show he managed to score a very modest 4.7 points on average per appearance. He was no longer the main attraction. He was an afterthought, an expensive project sitting at the end of the bench. This demotion sparked a deep, hidden resentment within Sly Williams. The psychological toll of watching others take the spotlight began to slowly unravel his confidence. He felt completely misunderstood by his coaches, convinced that they were deliberately holding him back. His body language during timeouts spoke volumes, radiating a silent, simmering frustration. It seemed as though his highly publicized career was destined to fizzle out before it ever truly began. But the following year, the scoreboard would light up with numbers that made the entire city of New York gasp in utter astonishment. The unforgiving benches of the professional league have broken the spirits of countless talented young men. But Sly Williams was determined not to fade into complete obscurity. He realized that raw talent alone was no longer enough. He needed to adapt, to force his way into the rotation through sheer willpower and aggression on the boards. The turning point arrived with a sudden explosive surge in his performance that left both critics and fans absolutely speechless. According to the official player statistics carefully maintained by the league, during the season of 1980 to 1981, his output experienced a massive, undeniable spike. He was suddenly commanding the paint, averaging a highly impressive 13.2 points and pulling down 6.2 rebounds per game. Those numbers were not just empty statistics. They represented a ferocious physical dominance that completely energized the massive crowds in New York. He was no longer the frustrated rookie. He was evolving into a genuine force, a crowd favorite who could ignite the arena with a single, gravity-defying play. The fans embraced his intense energy, completely oblivious to the turbulent storms raging beneath his confident exterior. There is a fascinating, almost forgotten historical detail surrounding his time in the city that adds a strange layer of irony to his legacy. Based on the deeply documented franchise uniform history of the New York Knicks, Sly Williams holds a unique, almost ghostly place in their archives. He was the very last player to ever wear the iconic number 33 jersey before it was famously handed over to the legendary Patrick Ewing in the year 1985. But why did a player with such an upward trajectory ultimately surrender his place in the spotlight? While the fans in the stands were busy chanting his name and wearing his jersey, the reality behind closed doors was entirely different. The front office was desperately trying to manage a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Deep inside the executive suites, confidential memos and alarming disciplinary reports were beginning to stack up on the general manager's desk. And it was exactly those hidden documents that would soon trigger a chain of events nobody could have possibly predicted. By all outward appearances, Sly Williams had finally conquered the monumental pressures of playing in the biggest media market in the world. He was delivering the best numbers of his entire professional life, showcasing a brilliant blend of athletic prowess and scoring capability. According to the official regular season protocols, during the 1981 to 1982 campaign, he reached a magnificent career maximum. He stepped onto the hardwood for 60 games and delivered an average of 13.9 points per contest. To the casual observer tuning into the television broadcasts, he looked like a superstar firmly in control of his destiny. But the blinding glare of peak performance was masking a terrifying double life that was slowly tearing him apart from the inside out. The rumors echoing through the corridors of the arena painted a deeply troubling picture. Journalists and team insiders began whispering about chronically missed team flights, mysterious absences from crucial practice sessions, and highly erratic behavior that frustrated the entire coaching staff. The player who could dominate an opponent on Tuesday would suddenly appear completely disengaged and lethargic by Thursday. According to later interview transcripts secured by sports investigative reporters, Sly Williams himself provided a chilling insight into his deeply fractured mindset during those peak years. He confessed with brutal honesty, stating, "If it was not a big game, I was just lost." This quote acts as a massive red flag in our investigation. How could a professional athlete, earning substantial amounts of money, simply switch off his motivation based on the opponent? It was a clear indicator of deep psychological exhaustion and a creeping reliance on destructive coping mechanisms to survive the grueling schedule. The New York management tried everything to keep their explosive forward on the straight and narrow, covering up his indiscretions to protect their highly valuable investment. However, maintaining that fragile illusion became mathematically and emotionally impossible. The executives tolerated his chaotic antics right up until the breaking point. And that breaking point arrived with a shocking internal financial decision leading to a massive leak in the press in the spring of 1983 that completely turned his world upside down. The sudden expulsion of a highly productive player from a major market franchise is always shrouded in mystery and furious speculation. When the news broke, the basketball community was left scrambling for answers. Why would New York deliberately discard a forward who was consistently delivering double-digit scoring figures? The official statements cited a desire to restructure the roster, but the underlying truth was far more sinister. The franchise had simply grown exhausted by the immense collateral damage of managing his off-court turbulence. According to the official league transaction records, in the sweltering summer of 1983, Sly Williams was abruptly traded to the Atlanta Hawks. It was a swift, unceremonious exit from the bright lights of the big city, a clear message that his deeply concerning habits had finally overshadowed his undeniable talent. The executives in Atlanta believed they could achieve what New York could not. They thought they could tame the troubled star by offering him a change of scenery and a fresh start. They completely underestimated the depth of his internal struggles. The move to a new city did not cure his demons. It merely provided them with a new playground. His motivation, already dangerously fragile, began to evaporate almost immediately. We can see the devastating impact of this psychological decline reflected directly in the hard data. In the summaries provided by the sports press for the 1983 to 1984 season, his performance suffered a catastrophic collapse. He participated in a mere 13 games, and his offensive production plummeted to just 8.1 points per game. The physical tools were all still there, but the fire that once drove him to dominate the paint had been thoroughly extinguished. He was physically present in a Hawks uniform, but mentally he was drifting further and further away from the professional standards required to survive in the league. Sly Williams would eventually attempt to pull himself together and stage one last desperate comeback for Atlanta. But right at the exact moment he tried to salvage his crumbling career on the court, an incredibly dark emotional and financial catastrophe began unfolding in his personal life that would push him past the point of no return. The flicker of hope in professional sports can often be the most agonizing part of a player's decline. For Sly Williams, the city of Atlanta briefly looked like a place of redemption. He desperately tried to pull himself together, stepping onto the court with a renewed sense of urgency that reminded everyone of his undeniable pedigree. When we examine the official documents of the Basketball Association, there is a clear, undeniable spike in his production during the season of 1984 to 1985. He managed to play in 34 games and pushed his scoring average back up to a highly respectable 12.3 points per contest. Fans watching the broadcasts might have thought the turbulent forward had finally matured, but the agonizing truth was hidden far away from the cameras. Behind the locked doors of his home, his personal life was utterly collapsing, dragging his fragile psyche down into an inescapable abyss. According to the deeply personal admissions he made years later during a prison interview, the psychological burden had simply become too heavy to carry. He openly stated that his marriage was falling apart in those days, and as a direct result, the game of basketball completely ceased to matter to him. This tragic revelation from his own lips is the missing puzzle piece that explains his sudden, total disengagement. The executives in the front office were completely baffled by his rapid mood swings, unaware that the man wearing their uniform was fighting a losing battle against his own mind. His internal torment ultimately suffocated whatever drive he had left, making it impossible to perform at the elite level the league demanded. It looked like the absolute end of the road, a quiet fade into obscurity for a player who once promised so much. But then, in the autumn of 1985, his telephone rang with a completely unexpected offer from the most legendary, decorated franchise in the entire history of the sport. The mere mention of the Boston organization commands absolute respect. It is a franchise built on an uncompromising culture of discipline, a place where only the most dedicated athletes survive. So, when the news broke that Sly Williams was heading to Massachusetts, the entire league was completely stunned. Based on the official transaction archives carefully preserved by the team, he signed a contract in the autumn of 1985, stepping into a locker room filled with established superstars and fierce competitors. Management took a massive gamble, believing that the legendary championship environment would finally force the troubled forward to respect the game. It was supposed to be his ultimate salvation, a golden opportunity to rewrite his controversial legacy surrounded by greatness. However, the exact opposite happened. The relentless pressure and the rigid, demanding structure of the Boston culture quickly transformed into a psychological prison for a man already teetering on the edge. The cold, hard data from the team's game logs tells a devastating story of his brief tenure in green. Between October and November of 1985, he appeared in a mere 6 games, scraping together an absolutely dismal average of 2.8 points. He looked completely lost on the legendary parquet floor, a shadow of the explosive scorer who had once electrified New York. According to the reports filed by sports journalists covering the team, his inability to adapt to the complex offensive schemes and strict rules was painfully obvious. He was a chaotic variable in a perfectly tuned championship machine, and the coaching staff had zero tolerance for his ongoing personal struggles. The grand experiment lasted for only a few agonizing weeks, leading directly to a cold, formal meeting in the front office on the 2nd of December that would officially sever his ties to professional basketball forever. In the ruthless business of professional sports, there is absolutely no room for sentimentality when a player becomes a liability. The definitive end did not arrive with a glorious final shot or a tearful farewell press conference. It came with a sterile, bureaucratic decision. According to the official press releases issued by the club, the 2nd of December 1985 was the exact day the Boston front office officially waived Sly Williams, unceremoniously terminating his contract and his career. The news sent a massive shockwave through his world, a brutal confirmation of his ultimate failure to belong among the elite. The psychological devastation of that single piece of paper cannot be overstated. He was forced to watch from the absolute bottom as the very team that discarded him went on an unstoppable run. The historical chronicles of the league explicitly document that in the spring of 1986, Boston captured the championship title, raising the banner high into the rafters while the man they cut was left completely forgotten. He realized with terrifying clarity that the league had not only moved on without him, but it had actually thrived in his absence. This crushing sense of being completely unwanted and discarded shattered whatever remained of his fragile self-esteem. According to investigative biographers who later tracked his movements, the loss of his identity as a professional athlete pushed him into a profound, suffocating despair. The bright lights, the roaring crowds, and the massive paychecks vanished overnight, replaced by an agonizing emptiness. He was no longer a star. He was a ghost haunting his own memories. When the stadium lights finally shut off and the cheering completely stopped, Sly Williams was left entirely alone with a deafening silence. And it was precisely in that terrible silence that he opened the door to his darkest, most destructive dependencies. Sly Williams found himself completely untethered from the only reality he had ever known. The sudden loss of his elite athlete status plunged him into a profound and suffocating despair. By the late 1980s, investigative sports biographers noted that he was completely isolated from the basketball community that once worshipped him. He was no longer a towering figure on the court. He was a man aggressively trying to escape his own agonizing memories. In a desperate bid to numb the immense psychological pain, he plunged deep into the incredibly dangerous world of illicit substances. The massive void left by the roaring fans was quickly filled by incredibly dark and destructive habits. This was not just a sudden slump. It was a devastating free fall into the absolute abyss. In later interviews compiled by journalists, Williams offered a deeply chilling look into his fractured mental state during those exact years. He confessed to reporters, stating, "I sat there not knowing where to turn, and incredibly dark thoughts about ending everything visited me constantly." This harrowing quote reveals a man completely paralyzed by his own internal demons. He was silently begging for an intervention, but the world of professional sports had already turned its back and moved on to the next young phenomenon. He was asking for a lifeline, but absolutely nobody heard his desperate pleas. And so, the former superstar began to physically and emotionally dissolve onto the gritty streets, embarking on a turbulent journey that would see him drift through 4 different states over the next 15 agonizing years. Where do fallen stars actually go when the bright stadium lights finally burn out? For Sly Williams, the answer lay in a grueling, almost unrecognizable existence, far away from the glitz and glamour of professional arenas. Between the years 1986 and 2001, exhaustive media investigations revealed that the former first-round draft pick vanished into absolute obscurity, residing in 4 entirely different states. He was no longer signing multi-million-dollar contracts. Instead, he was desperately trying to hide from the agonizing humiliation of public recognition. According to profiles published by specialty sports magazines tracking former athletes, by the early 1990s, he was surviving on random, grueling, odd jobs without any stable source of income. He traded his iconic number 33 jersey for the worn, heavy clothes of a manual laborer. But the physical exhaustion of these low-paying jobs could not suppress the incredibly explosive anger simmering just beneath his surface. His mounting aggression and deep-seated resentments were slowly transforming him into a highly unpredictable and dangerous individual. For years, these alarming behavioral shifts remained completely hidden from the sports press, buried under the daily struggle for mere survival. He became a ghost, hiding on the fringes of society while wrestling with the crushing weight of his monumental failures. The national journalists had completely lost track of his whereabouts, assuming he had just quietly faded away until the year 1991, when the name Sly Williams suddenly and violently resurfaced in the alarming police dispatches of Connecticut. The transition from a troubled, forgotten athlete to a legitimate threat to society happened behind closed doors, but the terrifying results eventually spilled out into the open. The first major crack in his carefully constructed facade of a quiet laborer occurred during a highly disturbing incident that completely shattered his anonymity. According to the deeply unsettling public court records of the state of Connecticut, in the year 1991, Sly Williams found himself standing before a judge, no longer as a sports hero, but as a criminal defendant. The details of the case were absolutely chilling. In the official indictment documents presented by the prosecution, the former basketball star faced incredibly serious allegations regarding the unlawful restraint of a woman. It was a terrifying glimpse into the deeply violent tendencies that had taken root in his fractured psyche. He had used his massive, imposing physical frame not to grab a crucial rebound, but to instill absolute terror. However, the justice system, perhaps swayed by his previous status or the efforts of his highly paid legal counsel, decided to grant him a remarkably lenient second chance. Based on the official legal rulings of that exact year, the judge handed down a suspended sentence of 5 years of probation. The system essentially closed its eyes to the severity of the confrontation, allowing a deeply unstable man to walk right out the front doors of the courthouse. He had managed to narrowly escape the cold reality of a prison cell, but he absolutely did not use this massive opportunity to seek the rehabilitation he so desperately needed. If that Connecticut judge had possessed any idea of the absolute horrors that would unfold 10 years later in the quiet town of Binghamton, he would have never allowed Sly Williams to walk free. In the early years of the new millennium, specifically around the year 2001, the former basketball sensation attempted to completely erase his highly publicized past by relocating to the quiet, unassuming city of Binghamton, New York. According to the local registration files from that period, Sly Williams was no longer chasing multi-million-dollar athletic contracts. Instead, he was desperately seeking the ultimate illusion of normality. He secured employment as a blue-collar worker at a local facility that manufactured plastic pipes. The official employment verification documents presented during his subsequent legal troubles confirmed that he spent his days operating heavy machinery, blending perfectly into the background of a sleepy industrial town. His new colleagues on the factory floor saw a remarkably tall, quiet man with heavily calloused hands, completely oblivious to the fact that he was once a first-round draft pick who had shared the court with absolute legends. He was living a bizarre double life, playing the role of a humble laborer, while the incredibly dark, aggressive tendencies from his past continued to fester just beneath the surface. The bright lights of the arenas were permanently replaced by the harsh, fluorescent glow of the factory floor. However, this carefully constructed facade of a peaceful existence was nothing more than a ticking time bomb. According to the investigative journalists who later reconstructed his timeline, Sly Williams spent the daylight hours cutting plastic pipes, but the nights belonged to his uncontrollable inner demons. His unsuspecting factory co-workers had absolutely no idea that this silent giant was slowly unraveling, and they certainly could not predict that in September of the year 2001, he would cross a terrifying line from which there was absolutely no return. The fragile illusion of a quiet life in Binghamton was violently shattered during a deeply disturbing sequence of events that sent shockwaves through the local community. The official law enforcement incident reports paint a terrifying picture of exactly what happened behind the locked doors of his residence. According to the deeply detailed investigative materials, in the month of September of the year 2001, Sly Williams held an unsuspecting woman completely against her will for a grueling period of approximately 24 hours. This was not a sudden outburst. It was a calculated, terrifying display of power and control. In the formal indictment documents presented by the district attorney, it was heavily featured that the former professional athlete utilized a knife as an instrument of coercion to maintain his physical dominance over the victim. The man who was once celebrated for his spectacular slam dunks was now using his massive, imposing frame to inflict absolute psychological and physical terror. The gripping public materials surrounding the case reveal a horrific ordeal where the victim was trapped in a nightmare, facing a deeply unstable individual who had completely lost touch with reality. By some miraculous turn of events, the woman ultimately managed to escape his violent grasp and alert the authorities to the severe trauma she had endured. But the most staggering, unbelievable detail found within the law enforcement chronologies is that the police were entirely unable to locate and apprehend Sly Williams in the immediate aftermath of this highly alarming crime. He vanished into the shadows of the city, evading justice for months, and it was precisely during this exact period of agonizing suspense that he zeroed in on his next target. The glaring failure of the local authorities to immediately capture him seemingly injected Sly Williams with an incredibly dangerous sense of invincibility. He mistakenly believed that he could continue to operate completely outside the boundaries of the law without facing any serious repercussions. However, this twisted delusion violently collided with reality just a few months later. According to the gripping criminal chronicles of Binghamton, in January of the year 2002, a brand new, highly severe accusation of violence involving a second woman was officially filed against the former professional player. His deeply destructive behavior had finally caught up with him, triggering a massive, coordinated response from law enforcement. The intense police manhunt concluded during the bitter cold of winter in the year 2002, when the imposing forward was finally placed in heavy iron handcuffs. The agonizing irony of the situation was absolutely staggering. The very same hands that used to sign lucrative endorsement deals and shake hands with prominent politicians were now firmly locked behind his back. When we examine the official prosecutorial documents, it becomes completely clear that the authorities immediately consolidated both terrifying incidents into a single, massive legal proceeding. The walls of justice were rapidly closing in, leaving him with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Sitting inside the bleak, concrete holding cell of the county jail, the gravity of his monumental downfall finally crushed him. The seasoned prosecutor walked into the interrogation room and calmly placed a thick stack of documents on the metal table, papers that clearly outlined a legal strategy demanding decades behind bars. Faced with the incredibly severe reality of spending decades trapped inside a concrete cell, Sly Williams and his highly paid legal team were forced to quickly rethink their entire defense strategy. The towering man who used to confidently dictate the pace of the game on the professional hardwood was now entirely at the mercy of the rigid justice system. According to the meticulously detailed materials found within the judicial registry during the active investigation phase, the initial accusations leveled against him were absolutely devastating. The prosecution listed multiple felony counts ranging from burglary to highly serious physical violence against a vulnerable individual. The seasoned prosecutors held all the leverage in the room, systematically cornering the former star athlete with irrefutable evidence. In a desperate maneuver to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars, he agreed to a highly controversial plea deal. The district attorney agreed to drop a few of the secondary charges in exchange for a direct, undeniable admission of guilt on the primary, most terrifying offense. While sitting behind the thick, smudged glass of the Broome County Jail in the spring of the year 2002, a deeply humbled Sly Williams granted an incredibly revealing interview to investigative journalists. In that published article, he attempted to explain the profound unraveling of his once glorious life, stating with a chilling sense of resignation that his career was controversial and it was an absolute disaster. He desperately tried to reframe his horrifying criminal actions as the tragic, unavoidable consequences of his severe emotional depression and his sudden, brutal isolation from the sports world. However, the presiding judge was absolutely not interested in listening to carefully crafted excuses about his unfulfilled athletic potential or his internal psychological struggles. The legal system viewed him solely as a highly dangerous individual who had crossed an unforgivable line, and as the sweltering heat of August rapidly approached, the final devastating blow of the gavel became completely inevitable. The dramatic culmination of this incredibly dark legal saga arrived precisely when the sports world was busy preparing for a brand new season, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in a quiet New York courtroom. The imposing figure that once commanded absolute awe from millions of loyal fans now stood completely defeated before the judge's bench. Based on the official court documents and the verified transcripts from the hearings, in August of the year 2002, Sly Williams formally entered a guilty plea to the incredibly severe charge of kidnapping in the first degree. It was a staggering, very public admission that permanently shattered whatever remained of his heroic athletic image. The absolute shock of this legal finality resonated far beyond the cold walls of the courthouse. According to the deeply detailed reports published by major news agencies during the late summer of that same year, the judge handed down a definitive sentence of up to 5 years of hard time in a state correctional facility. The highly anticipated verdict sent an immediate, massive shockwave through the major sports publications, leaving the incredibly devoted supporters of the New York franchise completely devastated and bewildered. The explosive man they used to cheer for, the incredibly gifted forward who once seemed destined to rewrite the league record books, was now trading his iconic jersey for standard-issue prison garments. The heavy steel door of his cell slammed completely shut, permanently severing his remaining ties to the outside world and isolating him with nothing but the agonizing ghosts of his ruined career. Yet, even as he began serving his mandatory time behind bars, completely stripped of his freedom and his dignity, a profound and highly disturbing question continued to haunt the minds of sports historians and psychological experts alike. When we take a step back and deeply analyze the entire downward trajectory of this fallen star, the ultimate legacy of Sly Williams serves as one of the most terrifying cautionary tales in the entire history of professional athletics. He was a phenomenal, once-in-a-generation talent who miraculously escaped the crushing poverty of his youth, only to be completely consumed by the massive pressures of elite competition and the incredibly dark temptations that followed. According to the conservative estimates provided by leading sports financial analysts throughout his turbulent professional career, the dynamic forward earned well over $1 million. However, due to his highly destructive habits and a complete lack of proper guidance, he tragically lost absolutely everything, leaving him entirely destitute and desperate. The unforgiving system of the professional basketball machine chewed up a psychologically vulnerable young man and unceremoniously spat him out the exact moment his physical performance began to decline. When we consult the official archives and the esteemed halls of fame of the league, the definitive statistics show that his highly promising career abruptly halted after exactly 7 seasons, culminating in a total of 305 official games played. Those numbers do not represent a glorious triumph. They represent a monumental tragedy of unfulfilled potential and a life completely derailed by bad choices and severe dependencies. The deeply unsettling story of Sly Williams forces us to confront the incredibly high human cost of athletic entertainment. It leaves us to wonder just how many other brilliantly talented individuals are currently hiding their severe internal demons behind million-dollar smiles and spectacular plays, secretly waiting for the exact moment when the bright arena lights finally turn off and the absolute darkness takes over.